Like and subscribe. Pretty please. Autopsy doctors of Reddit. What was the biggest revelation you had to a person's death after you carried out the procedure? Assisted with a post-mortem. When I was a student, female patient died in her 40s. Her medical history had extensive complaints of abdominal pains. One doctor even referred to her as a hypochondriac, and others commented on apparent anxiety. Opened her abdomen, and she had extensive scar tissue. She was absolutely massacred inside from endometriosis. She suffered for decades, and never got referred for a laparoscopy. She didn't have fucking anxiety, she had a medical condition. When my parents were in medical school, they attended an autopsy of a patient who had died in a car accident. Autopsy revealed that apparently, this guy had survived a chest shot in Vietnam years ago that the surgeon/medics left in rather than perform risky surgery. The accident had migrated the bullet to his heart and was ruled the cause of death. Last casualty of the Vietnam War. This was actually in the 90s, a bit before I was born. Actually, this does make me wonder if there's a possibility for other Vietnam veterans or Korean War veterans to possibly have a similar situation, or straight up lead poisoning, or in the future, if there's a chance for this to happen to Iraq or Afghanistan veterans. Not mine, but a doctor I used to work with back when he was in school. He would do his cadaver labs really late at night. Too many people during the day. One time it was really late, around 2 AM. He was listening to his lecture on his headphones, and he saw the cadaver's arm move/twitch. He thought it was just his mind playing tricks on him. Then he saw it again. Proceeded to run away in a panic. He told a few of his classmates what happened, but nobody believed him. Next day they had a group cadaver lab with the same cadaver. The arm twitched yet again. The professor did some digging, and it turns out the patient's pacemaker was still fully functional and occasionally fired, causing the arm twitch. He was so relieved. He thought there was a zombie in there. I may be late to the party, but I finally have a good story to tell. In medical school, my group's cadaver was an 80-plus-year-old female who was extremely unfit, morbidly obese, with muscles half the size of any other cadavers. Her pectoral muscles were paper thin. To get some reference, we figured she was bedridden during her last few months, which would somewhat explain these findings when we started on urology unit and began to dissect the infratemporal fossa. I discovered a small metal pellet under the skin behind her right ear. My tank mates and I went on to find dozens of these metal pellets strewn around her head's anatomy, with some lodged into the cranium and others in the bones of her face. We contacted her living relatives to get some clarification, and they ended up revealing that when this lady and her brother were children, they said she was 8 years old. They were playing with an old decorative rifle that the family had mounted above the fireplace. Long story short, the brother accidentally discharged the rifle into the girl's face. The aftermath was this lady was blind and wheelchair bound for the rest of her life, and the pellets weren't all removed. It was an interesting dissection with that information from then on, but a sobering moment in reminding our class that our cadavers are humans, with their own struggles and rich lives. If you're considering donating your body to science, please know that we don't take the responsibility lightly, and a million thanks aren't enough. My friend once cremated a lady, and when they pulled the table out, there were 3 sets of forceps sitting there. Most likely she died in surgery, but I always thought it was crazy those were left in, and whatever metal they are made of, clearly has a higher melting point than cremation temps. After my mother was cremated, my sister was curious and wanted to take a peek at her ashes inside the urn. She opened it and said, "Oh." Right on top of these fine ashes was the hardware from the broken ankle repair she had gotten years before. Yeah, no, the ashes are only fine because they're ground up. Without that, you'd have chunks of bone. My friend had to do an autopsy on a baby. The dad claimed she died after rolling off a couch. My friend found that the kid was slammed against a hard surface multiple times. Dad eventually admitted he hit the baby against the wall. After she wouldn't stop crying, my friend had to quit that job cause it was so taxing mentally. The sad part about this is that babies sometimes just cry. There is nothing wrong with them. They are tired and just can't sleep. It's common for hospitals to specifically warn new parents not to shake their babies because sleep-deprived parents with colicky babies are sometimes driven to do that out of desperation, but I have never heard them having to warn specifically about slamming your baby into a wall. While in medical school, we had to observe an autopsy and could assist. One of the lectures was to observe forehead trauma. You do this by hitting the skull with a hard object, scissor or the like. A hollow sound is normal, but a dull sound indicates trauma. One of the other students did this exam and found a dull sound. The coroner had not yet himself examined the person and was very surprised. As he had not been informed by the police of head trauma, they then continued to examine the head, and they found a gunshot wound through the skull. All of a sudden, the person was a crime scene, and they had to call the police again and leave the person as into shade as possible. I believe it was later confirmed that the person had shot himself, but it could have been a murder. Masters in forensic pathology here. You'd be surprised to know the number of people that have life-threatening issues that never went diagnosed and that they didn't die from. Seen an older guy who died of pneumonia in hospital. On autopsy, the guy had both an enlarged heart and a couple of medium-sized aneurysms in the brain. Another guy in his 70s apparently came into the ER and had chest pain. Then died shortly after, dies of a heart attack, but also had cancer. In less natural circumstances though, saw a guy who had been shot in the head a couple of times. 3 definite entries and a blown out skull, but police only found 1 bullet. Couldn't find the other bullet in his head at all. Assumed the police missed it. Went on as normal with the autopsy until we got to the chest cavity. The other bullet was just chilling beside his lung. Turns out it entered the skull, hit the inside, ricocheted down his neck, and into the chest. That was pretty wild. It's so wild to me how on the one side, humans can be so resilient and survive horrible things, and on the other side, just how fragile and quick life can be taken from us. 2 very different extremes. I'm a veterinarian, and sometimes I do necropsy, basically autopsy for animals, and one of the more notable cases involved a prized Wagyu cow that died mysteriously. Wagyu cows are very expensive to rear and fetch a good price at the slaughterhouse. After cutting her open, I found metal wires extending from her stomach into her heart. It's what we call "hardware disease." Apparently the cow decided that eating metal wires for constructing fences was a good idea. Normally the farmhands are quite good at keeping these hazards away from the inquisitive bovines, but I guess slip up do happen from time to time. Why are you eating that? Dumb cow. I took forensic lectures, so I saw quite a bit of crazy shit, but the things that stick is an autopsy revealing a history of abuse, pain, and violence. A little more funny, a skeleton was found in the near mountains. It was very clear he died in an accident 20 plus years ago. However, he had to be identified via DNA. Turned out, his dad was not his dad, but his uncle. Sparked a whole public family drama show. Cause the family was well known in my area. Not exactly an autopsy per se, but it was a patient found unresponsive, with CPR in progress by EMS. The man was clearly homeless, based on his appearance and smell. He reportedly had not been seen for several days by his friends, and was eventually found behind a fast food restaurant dumpster. We were briefly able to get a pulse back, and when the nurse cut his pants off to place a catheter, we saw the cause. He had fashioned some sort of makeshift cock ring out of the neck of a plastic bottle. It was way too tight and completely cut off the circulation. The penis was fully black and necrotic. I did a bedside ultrasound and found his abdomen full of free fluid, which is bad. Most likely his bladder had ruptured from being unable to urinate for days. His lab suggested he was in septic shock and full-blown renal failure as well. He did not survive much longer than that. My wife is a pathologist assistant, and during her schooling carried out the autopsy of a newborn that died minutes after birth. The mother was desperate for a child and had a history of multiple miscarriages at different terms. This was her first time making it full term, and all prenatal checkups revealed no problems. The delivery was difficult, but successful, and baby was alive for a short time. Skip to autopsy. All signs point to baby being fully developed. Get to the abdominal cavity and the liver is lacerated and hemorrhage everywhere. During the difficult delivery, the resident used too much force with the forceps to pull the baby out. The ruptured liver then caused the baby to bleed out internally. Wife was enthusiastic about autopsy up to this point. Now has no interest. Oof. Could you imagine finally carrying to term just to have one of the medical staff make a mistake like that? My dad used to perform autopsies. His best story was that they were brought a body that has no real indication of any issues. After examining the body, the only thing of note was that there was blood coming out of the guy's rectum. They begin the autopsy and the guy's organs are completely liquefied and the body cavity is filled with lead shot. It became apparent really quickly that someone had shoved a shotgun up his ass and pulled the trigger. This was in the 70s, and I still have to wonder what this guy did to piss someone off enough to get a shotgun up his ass. How did the shotgun blast not show any outward signs? One would imagine at least some kind of visible wound from that. That guy must have clenched his cheeks hard. Sheep farmer. I have to know how to do a necropsy for when something dies, to know if it's something that could spread. Had a ewe fall over dead after losing a ton of weight, and after treating her for everything under the sun, she would gasp for air and struggle to breathe, but antibiotics, steroids, and anti-inflammatory drugs didn't touch it. She finally passed away, and I cut her open to see what the hell happened. Fully expecting to see her lungs riddled with shit. Her heart was 5 times the normal size and hard as a river stone. My guess is she'd had that issue her whole life and it didn't kill her until she was 2. This story circulates every year at my medical school. A body came in with a gunshot wound to the chest. There was no exit wound. They tried to locate the bullet during the autopsy. No success. They then did a whole scan, X-ray, or CT of the upper chest/abdomen/pelvis. No bullet. At that point, someone said fuck it, let's scan the whole body. Lo and behold, the bullet was detected in the popliteal fossa area behind the knee. It had embolized/traveled from the heart all the way down the arterial system to the knee, where it got stuck in one of the narrower blood vessels. In college, I took a figure drawing class, and the teacher was adamant that you couldn't draw the figure if you didn't know what was in it. So he dragged us over to the anatomy lab and had the anatomy teacher show us 2 cadavers that were being dissected by their med students. When it came time to ask questions, of course, have you ever found something weird in a body came up. The story is as follows. They get a body, and for legal reasons they aren't told much about the person. Aside from medical history, they were told that the old man was a sort of rock star type and was a one-hit wonder from his youth, and to use extra discretion with him in particular, / not tell the students who might recognize him. The lab is full of 20-year-olds, and so nobody recognized who he was, unsure if the teacher even knew. But it didn't sound like she did, or what his deal was, so they wrote it off as non-useful information. Aside from his lifestyle, he had drug use and alcohol issues in his life, and they were told he partied a lot. Cool. The body has a raging boner, like 100% of the time. Teacher doesn't think much of it. Aside from that, he was particular in doubt, and everybody wrote it off as not important to their studies, so they go through the general dissection that they do. One kid wants extra credit, and the teacher said sure, dissect his penis/see why it's hard still, and write a report. Apparently they don't normally do that for that particular class, so the penis itself goes into shade from their dissections, so it would have otherwise always been a mystery. Kid finds an actual rod that he had medically inserted under the table, not in medical records, so that he would always have a boner and could get it up while on drugs. They suspect it was done over 30 to 40 years prior to his death. They removed it and keep it in the lab, I believe, to show their students as part of a section on under the table medical surgeries. Anyways, that was probably the best day in figure drawing class I've ever had. I heard a story once about a guy who died, and completely unrelated to the main complaint during the autopsy, they found a grapefruit in his ass. Apparently it had just been there the whole time. I've heard of a navel orange, but never an anal grapefruit. I'm a pre-med student, and one time, while shadowing a forensic pathologist, 3 days before Christmas, He was doing an autopsy on an automobile versus pedestrian accident. The man's face was completely smashed in. When they take samples of the brain, they cut the skin, pull it over the face, and they cut off the top of the skull. When they did that, the skull was basically shattered, and bone fragments pulled back with the skin. And when they cut off the skull cap, the brain was obviously damaged, and the eyeballs had been pushed back, fallen through the orbits, and into the cranial cavity. The guy also had $10,000 in cash in his jean pockets. According to police, he had a record involving drugs, so the theory was either a drug deal gone bad, or he stumbled into the road while under the influence. Training in the medical examiner's office. Elderly woman found dead by herself in her home. There was nothing suspicious, so I was given the case, took out all the organs, dissected everything. Completely unremarkable. I cut through the larynx as a last step before I could clean up and finish the case, and boom. Giant piece of chicken lodged in her windpipe. Died choking on dinner. I'm single and happy being single, and honestly I think about that scenario too often. Choking on my food. Dying alone in my apartment. My cat eating my face. I did the autopsy of both the robber and his victim. The robber shot the victim in the back when he tried to escape in a motorcycle, and the robber was shot by the police in the exact same situation. What's interesting is that they both died by exactly the same lesion. Both of them had their fourth lumbar vertebra shattered, and their aorta, main artery of the body, sectioned at the same level. I thought of it like an extreme example of instant karma. Not a doctor, but a whole body scientific donation technician. I'm the person who dissects cadavers after they were donated. We very commonly would get young cases, normally overdoses. Had a mid-30s female, went to medical examiner prior to donation, but they only did an external evaluation. I went to check her genitals to see if I could palpate a uterus. Found a condom full of pills, similar to most. The body became a crime scene and we couldn't touch her. When we finally were able to continue, they asked us to photograph the pills to send to the examiner's office. They were mostly Advil and Zyrtec. Easily one of the weirdest things I've ever found. My theory is she was gonna start carrying drugs that way, but wanted to practice with something that wouldn't kill her first. My high school science teacher was a coroner, or whatever, and one day was asked to perform an autopsy on a little girl who was shot by a shotgun. He quit on the spot. He was an absolutely fantastic teacher. Someone close to me worked in refrigeration and was called to go to a working morgue room where bodies were on racks, not in wall units, where the fridge unit was loud, and was told the bodies would all be covered. He went there, and most were not covered, and many had stained sheets on them. He mustered up enough guts to get to the buzzing refrigerator unit on the ceiling. He then noticed a small wheel table with uncovered parts on it. It ended up being a baby cut into pieces. He noped the F out after that. Forensic pathologist here to come to mind. I had just moved back to my home state where family lives. Get a case with a man with a distinctive last name in the family tree. I put a text out to my mom to see if we were related, but before she texted back, I pulled the sheet back and already knew he looked like me. It was my great uncle. Get a case where it's a house fire death. On exam he's got multiple textbook stab and incised wounds. I spend the next 30 minutes getting gaslighted, quizzed by police department about are you sure, because they thought this was a straightforward house fire. Unfun fact, fire's not an uncommon way for people to try to conceal a homicide. Thanks for watching, like and subscribe.